before we begin, as it used to in public events in Canada, we're going to do our land acknowledgement. We're going to um, recognize the peoples and the lands on which we stand and that we've journeyed through. Um, Knowing that we do this to reaffirm our responsibility in restoring relationships between nations and to restate our commitment to understanding Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We acknowledge that diverse Indigenous communities have radically dissenting um, views on the significance and the importance and the relevance of land acknowledgements, and that as settlers, we have to learn to inhabit that discomfort of not knowing if the acknowledgement we are doing is right or not. We are just doing the best we can at the moment to repair those relationships. So, in an attempt to inhabit the ambiguity, the discomfort of not knowing whether this process is a process we should do and how we should do it, at ICS we've undertaken a practice through which we just craft individual land acknowledgements, where each person, whoever introduces the event, um, connects people to the lands and the peoples that have nourished them. Today, because I'm introducing the event, I get to give my land acknowledgement and talk about the lands that have nourished my journey and that I come from and the peoples that inhabit them. So I acknowledge, as you can tell by my accent, that I am an immigrant to Turtle Island. I came here willingly as an adult, able to escape um, the many types of violence that afflict my country of origin. I was born and raised in the northwest corner of Abayala of South America, a land of countless ancestral peoples, among them the Muisca, the Chibcha, the Paez, the Tairona, and the Quimbaya. My family comes from the place that you see in the picture, from the valley of Subachoque. In Chibcha language, that means the place where people are working in the front lines or in the line of fire, a land that was once shared and violently taken away from the Muisca and the Chibchas that inhabited it in the 1500s. As a newcomer to Canada, I acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. I acknowledge the treaties that were made on these territories, both among Indigenous peoples and then between Indigenous peoples and European settlers. I recognize that I too have become a Canadian settler and that with the oath of citizenship, I'm now connected to these treaties as well as to the historical atrocities committed in the name of what we now call Canada. I am deeply grateful that in the midst of such disproportionate oppression and discrimination, the ancestral communities that inhabit Toronto are sharing this land with me as a place where I can live and learn and love freely. I invite, we invite everybody to reflect about the traditional territories that have nourished your own journeys. Where you stand now, the territories of the institutions that you are part of, the places that you've been before, where you studied, where you loved, where you have your life before. Think about that. Those of you who are online, we invite you to write the names of the treaties, the peoples, the communities that you feel is important to acknowledge right now. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ronald Kuipers, ICS president and the director of the Center for Philosophy, Religion, and Social Ethics that is organizing this event, but also a member here first. So you're bringing both worlds together. So, Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hector. As George Costanza might say, worlds are colliding. But anyway, before I introduce today's speakers, which is my pleasure to do, I just want to introduce Hector a bit more. Hector Serra Ferrer is Not least, he's my PhD candidate. I'm supervising his PhD work at the Institute for Christian Studies, but he's also an employee at the Institute, and he wears many hats. He's the director of lifelong learning, and we're going to be leaning into lifelong learning a lot more extensively in the future. And so keep an eye on what we're going to be offering that space, things like today. And with me, you're the associate director of the Center for Philosophy, Religion, and Social Ethics, which is another place where we do curate events and conferences and things like that. So Hector's really kind of like a glue guy at the Institute, as they would say in hockey terms, right? Keeping everybody, holding everything together. And I didn't want to let that go unrecognized. But today I'm really happy that we could have the authors of Blessed Are the Undone here to talk about their work and about quiet faith deconstruction in Canada. So we have here with us today to talk about that book and to help us guide our conversation, Angela Reitsma Bick and Peter Schuurman. Angela is the editor-in-chief of the Christian Courier, an award-winning journalist recognized for her work highlighting social justice issues. And under her leadership, this independent Canadian publication, in my mind, has courageously hosted the kind of difficult conversations portrayed in the book we're discussing today. And I really appreciate when I get the Christian Courier in my mailbox, the different voices I disagree with, voices I agree with, but just the creation of a space for the kind of conversation across disagreements, I think, is really important for maintaining solidarity in the Christian community. In 2016, she won the A.C. Forrest Memorial Award for Excellence in Religious Journalism, which was followed by the Distinguished Alumni Award from Redeemer University in 2020. And she holds an honors BA from Redeemer University and an MA in Literature from Queen's University. Peter Schuurman is the director at Global Scholars Canada, a Christian professors guild devoted to supporting the cross-cultural and transnational work of Christian scholars in public university settings. He's also an adjunct faculty member at Redeemer University, and he holds an MA in sociology from Queen's University and a PhD in religious studies, is that right? From Wilfrid Laurier University. But according to your website, it was kind of a sociology project, but in a religious studies program. He's the author of The Subversive Evangelical, The Ironic Charisma of an Irreligious Megachurch, McGill Queen's University Press, 2019. And he also has a history as a campus minister at Brock University and a denominational ministry leader in the Christian Reformed Church. And one thing I noticed is that you were the CRC representative to the Faith and Witness Commission, which I also was in the 1990s. I don't know if you know that, but anyway, so please join me in welcoming Angela and Peter to our event today.
Thanks, Ron. It's good to be here. Let me say it was good to start with a land acknowledgement. We talk about issues related to such things in the book. It's a very important part of the book, and land is really where the book lands, if you see the concluding chapters. But there's another acknowledgement I want to make, and I have preached in this church before, and it's good to be back. But I know it's difficult times in the Christian Reformed Church, and I want to acknowledge maybe the pain and maybe just the wilderness or the transition that you're going through. And then ICS. ICS has been a very important part of my own academic development. I've taken courses at ICS, been at conferences at ICS, and especially as a campus minister, it was a good place to find people thinking about similar things. And it has been a place of inspiration and challenge for me. So to get into, I'm going to talk for 20 minutes and then Angela's going to talk for 20 minutes. I'm going to introduce most of the basics of the book and then Angela's going to take it in some fresher directions. But I want to start by saying we're about story. I'm a sociologist. She's a journalist. We are about stories. And I wanted to start with a story from the book. And I was trying to think of which one. And then I talked with Ari before I came up here. And Ari told me the story of his life where he came as an immigrant to Canada and was trying to find work and going to different places. And he bumped into the Bank of Commerce and met a veteran from 1945, a Canadian veteran who fought in the war and said, "You're hired." and then 40 years or whatever in the bank. And then he married a Catholic Polish girl against all the mores of the Christian Reformed Church. So story is important to me, and it's important to Angela. And that was part of the common ground that we began on in this book. All right. So where are we here? Oh, yes. Let's start with some context here. Stories and context. This is Canada over my lifetime. I was born just before 1970, 1969, when 90% of Canadians self-identified as Christian. The latest statistics I have from 2023 are 44%, 44.5%. It's almost exactly cut in half. And one thing that the sociologist C. Wright Mills said, personal troubles are public issues. And so we need to see what we're going to talk about today in social context. And that is the secularization of Canada. How did this happen? Like if I were to ask you just to shout out something, how did this happen in the last 50 years? What did this? I mean, secularization is a big sort of garbage can word, but anybody want to say something?
Corporate mergers.
Corporate mergers.
Affluence and being less needy.
Affluence and having less needs. Okay.
Abuse by.
Yes, we will talk about that. The pain of abuse by leaders in the church, especially.
Irrelevant Sundays.
Irrelevant Sundays that don't connect with Monday. All right. There's lots we could talk about. And in the book, we maybe make passing reference to some theories of this. But you can be assured that in the next few years, those two arrows are going to cross. And for the first time since Confederation, Christianity will be, and really already is, at 44% a minority religion in Canada. But it will be second to the religious nuns, which doesn't mean atheists, by the way, and I won't go into describing that. But that's the context of our book. And you can say very broadly and simply that the powerful, prestigious, privileged, and popular Christian religion, where they sang Amazing Grace at Parliament, where they had daily devotions on CBC at 8 a.m., is over. We've been to the mountaintop and we're on the other side. If that kind of Christendom isn't even desirable, Christianity is now a problematic religion in Canada and even a pariah. A recent report from Barna is that 36% of practicing Christians self-report as deconstructing. Now that's in America. I don't have stats for Canada, but I bet it's pretty close to the same. Maybe even more. But this word is making its way through the internet and through congregations, and people are grabbing onto it. And that's the instinct that Angela and I had, that this is significant. And that's what got us started in the book. And this is the project that we had. 28 people, Canadians, and we were very intentional in making this a Canadian book. And if you read it, you'll see right away our context is Canada. 28 Canadians who say they are deconstructing their faith. And we said recently, especially, because there's an acuteness to the deconstructing faith phenomena in North America. And you'll see the age there. It's not, some people say, can you come and talk to our church? And we've talked to a number of churches. We've lost a lot of young people. And I'm like, yeah, but that's just a piece of this. It's not just the youth that are deconstructing their faith. All right, you can see some of the details there. 14 males, 13 females, 1 non-binary, 24 were racially white. some pastors, some authors, some public figures there, including Michael Corrin, David Hayward, who you may know. Anyways, there's some details on our data and our collection, our sample. And this was our format in the interviews. Tell us about your faith. Where did you start? What did you inherit? You know, what does Christianity mean to you before what we're going to talk about? And then what happened? And why do you use this word deconstructing? And then finally, what's next? And usually we just sat back and listened. And afterwards, people said, "Thank you so much for this. I didn't realize it would feel so therapeutic." All right. And then there were 42 other stories we added to our 28. We got the transcripts from someone we interviewed, Josiah Mahon, who hosts the podcast Slow Train to Heck out of London, Ontario. And he similarly only interviews Canadians who are deconstructing their faith. I mean, there's a few other personalities he interviews, again, all Canadian. So we used that data as well. All right, the ideology of the canoe. Angela really came up with the canoe analogy, but me and my family go canoe camping every summer, and so it's important. I was cleaning up some old boxes and I found this Geist magazine from fall 1997 with an article entitled "The Ideology of the Canoe" by historian Daniel Francis. And there he says the canoe is actually the secret ideology of Canada for both Indigenous and settler. It is, quote, "the mother image of our national dream life, the symbol of our oneness with a rugged northern landscape, the vessel in which we are recreated as Canadians." The canoe, he argues, as much as the symbol of the beaver or the goose or the maple leaf, links us to land, to the past, to our Indigenous forebears and our spiritual roots. It is part of the myth of Canadian wilderness that fills Canadian lore. It jives with Margaret Atwood, who defined Canadian as being about survival. The canoe is a journey into the unknown, right? If you've ever been on a canoe trip, it's a spiritual quest, he says. It's a practice in becoming aware of the land and your surroundings. And it is the central symbol of our book, right on the title, right on the cover there. And did anyone recognize the colors of our title page, where they come from? No, of the book, our book. Yes, National Parks Canada. That's their colors. Yeah, that was very creative. Our designer came up with that. So there's 3 components to the book, and there's 3 components to a canoe trip, and there's 3 components to the deconstruction process: construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. In the metaphor we're using, setting up camp, breaking camp, and moving camp. Now, this could slip into a sort of pagan nationalism, right? The way Mr. Francis has configured this. And we're, of course, not seeing it in that way. But wilderness is certainly a universal experience. Wilderness is seen as the liminal space that is betwixt and between, a place of transition. In the biblical sense, a place of testing and trial and transformation. This art piece was commissioned by us to my niece, Nina Schuurman in Hamilton, and it highlights, as our cover does, that moment of the portage. Do you see the portage sign in the center there? That was very intentional to put that diagonal there. The portage is often the most excruciating part of the canoe trip. And if you've done it, especially without a path, with a canoe on your head, and you're sweating like a pig, and the mosquitoes are there, and you can't hit them because your hands are on the gunnel, right? But what happens? You get to a new lake. It brings you to a fresh expanse, new territory, the possibility of a fresh camp. And so that's an important part of our book. Our definition was undone. We came up with this idea of this term of the undone because we thought deconstruction, a lot of people don't like it. It sounds like destruction. And people talk about the religious nuns and the religious duns, and we thought, oh, we could just fit right in there with the undone. And so many people identified with that word, more so than deconstruction even. I feel undone. I feel like my world has been shattered, or like the rug has been pulled out from under me. I'm undone. And so it became the central term of our book. And you'll notice we have kind of a sociological definition of deconstruction or being undone that connects with the philosophical. And Jacques Derrida in the 60s really was the champion of the term. But some of the people we interviewed don't even know who Derrida is, or don't care, or don't read Derrida, right? This has become its own sociological phenomenon, deconstructing faith. And what we say there, it's about questioning, unraveling your relationship to the Bible and to the Christian faith and to the church. But at the same time, being distanced from a community. So there's a sociological shift happening there. It's not just an intellectual journey. And I guess, I wonder, oh yeah, well, there's David Hayward is an ex-pastor, the naked pastor, he calls himself, in New Brunswick. We interviewed him, and he does a lot of cartoons. He sells a lot of merchandise too. And deconstruction, don't be fooled, is a bit of an industry. People make money on this, right? As are a lot of parts of Christianity in North America. But he's a winsome fellow, and he's got a sense of humor. But really, Angela and I focused on deconstruction, not as just having doubts and questions, but not as deconversion either. And some people see those, deconstruction and deconversion as synonymous, and that's not true in terms of the people who use the term. Sometimes it's even a step along the way. People deconvert and then find their way back, right? So being undone is not just doubts, and it's not deconversion, but it's a crisis that takes place in people's lives where things fall apart. And in some ways, they take things apart. It also has some strong theological connections, and we have some chapters on that in our book. Ecclesiastes, there's a time to tear down and a time to build up. You could say Job went through a deconstruction of his faith as he assumed it was. You'll find it, it's an anachronism in many ways, but what we're saying is the phenomenon of having your theological, spiritual framework for life upended is part of the biblical story. And wilderness is part of the biblical story. Even I'll say, and we say this in the book directly, deconstruction is a normal and necessary part of spiritual formation, human development. It is, in a way, the core of the Christian faith. If you see baptism as a fall and a rise, right? As a dying to sin, to the self, and to all the baggage that we have, and rising anew with Christ in faith into Christ's kingdom of love and light. And don't mistake the people we talk to. They were not marginal believers. They were not nominal Christians. They were not cynical people who drifted out. These were hardcore people. We have a chapter called All In, because that term we heard over and over again. They were all in. And that's why the deconstruction experience is so devastating for most of the people we talk to. Here's a nice focus question right from our book. I don't know if this can be part of what happens this afternoon, but everyone deconstructs something. It's part of the human spiritual quest. Oh, gotta go back. Oh, I think I've lost my PowerPoint here. This is Angela's, right? If we could go back to the focus question. There we go. What time is it for you? What time is it for this church? What time is it for Christianity in North America? It's important to recognize the time we're in and participate in what the Holy Spirit is doing rather than going your own way. Because deconstruction is not just an individual journey with a canoe by yourself, with the portage. It's a journey together. And institutions, we think, are deconstructing as well, especially conservative North American evangelicalism, which is, for the most part, the focus of where most of the people we talked to started. All right, very quickly, I want to talk about the 7 triggers. This is the core of the book, 7 chapters in the middle. Triggers to deconstruction. What caused this journey to begin? Well, first of all, biblical inerrancy. As one Undone said to us, it's treated like the 4th member of the Trinity, the Bible, that is. Christianity has become a text-based religion, and as they say, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we returned the favor, turning a fleshy God incarnate into a book-based religion, as the Muslims mistakenly consider us, people of the book. 2, anti-science, young earth creationism. One 32-year-old Montrealer told us, you don't really question these things. You just accept it, and evolution is taken as a kind of joke. There are no other ways of seeing it. It's evolution against creation. 2 options. Anything else is off limits. God's word gets pitted against God's world in an either-or false dichotomy, and what the earth and stars are telling us is not to be trusted. The heavens may declare the glory of God, but not the age of the universe. 3, purity culture was a response to the promiscuity of the sexual revolution and its illusion of casual sex and free love. But purity culture became all about what you don't do, and if you do it, then you're done, dirty, and diseased, and disregarded, and that usually meant especially the young women. As one interviewee said, if you kiss your boyfriend, you're going to hell. 4, church scandals and clergy sexual abuse scandals in particular affect everyone in the congregation, and when a megachurch, many more people beyond that. Mike Cosper, who has a wonderful podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, calls it the incentivizing of grandiosity that was part of making the mess. Just one part, but an important part. When the news of megachurch pastor Bruxy Cavy's failure, something that I've, in my research, been very close to and I could talk a lot about, but anyways, when his failure spread through the internet, one of our interviewees said, it was like a bomb went off for everybody. Number 5, the prejudice against LGBTQ plus persons is quite significant in all the testimonies we heard. Almost all of our subjects became affirming in their sexual ethics during their deconstruction. And regardless of your take, as one conservative but open meeting houser said to a more conservative friend, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying they're here. 6, as for residential schools, one of our Undone interviewees said, there can be no deconstruction without decolonization. They go together. And the relationship with both Indigenous people and the land is key to the Canadian deconstructive moment. Finally, number 7, Trump's election, a man supported by 81% of white Christian American voters in 2016, was the pivotal point for many of our interviewees in their deconstruction. White Christian nationalism disguised as devotion to the Bible and God and the church broke them. One interviewee said, when people think Christian, they now think Trump. You don't have to agree with that, but that's the perception, right? All right. I'm going to take this one step deeper here, so pay attention to this. This is a key that's mentioned in the book, and this is for Canadian people especially to be aware. What we're calling the American thread through all the triggers. What is deconstructed? What's deconstructed by and large is religious resources that people got from the United States of America, and more specifically, conservative evangelicalism. Nobody said, I'm deconstructing C.S. Lewis and the Narnia books. Nobody said alpha has been, destructive to my spirituality. Nobody mentioned Tommy Douglas as, a bane in their spiritual journey. For the Bible, they talked about the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, or maybe they didn't mention it, but that's where it comes from. Science Creation Museum, and I could tell a story about that, about a pastor, youth pastor, young man, who was asked to take his youth group to the Creation Museum from Canada. And he said, I don't think I'm able to do that in good conscience because I'm reading some books right now. He was changing his perspective. He was deconstructing. And after a lot of arguing and many months, he lost his job and he was alienated from the church he grew up in as a child. Purity culture, True Love Waits, the silver ring thing, I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris, huge influence in Canada. Scandals, Mark Driscoll, Bill Hybels, LGBTQ+. This is a little trickier. This is not just the US, but it is interesting that the US was 10 years behind Canada in terms of legalizing same-sex marriage. Christian nationalism, of course, Donald Trump. And you may know a book by John Wayne, by Kristen Dumais, who was part of an ICS conference last year. Residential schools. This is a trickier one. This didn't come up much, and I'm gonna shift to the next slide here. This is the number of people who mentioned the 7 triggers, and I don't know. I hope you can see that. And you'll see colonization only came up with 2 people. Why did we give it a chapter? Well, this is very interesting. Colonization may not have featured much, but as I said earlier, 2 people said you cannot have deconstruction with decolonization. And maybe it's the point that it didn't show up, because if deconstruction is deconstructing American religious resources, it's not going to show up in their socialization and in their spiritual development. So then we intuitively said, we're going to give this a chapter because its absence is the point. Do you understand what I'm saying there? Its absence is the point. And there's less on biblical inerrancy in Young Earth that was directly mentioned. But again, you'll see the science chapter, the 2 that mentioned it, well, there's more than 2, but they have their own podcasts on it. And they're public figures in Canada. It's huge for them. All right. How am I doing for time? How many? I'm already over? Okay. Well, I'm going to zip through this really fast. Okay. While much of what was being deconstructed is traceable to right-wing, Republican, American religious resources, as I just showed, much of the resources for deconstructing those resources, in a sort of reconstruction, were left-wing, progressive Democrat American podcasts. And so this leads me to ask, can we break out of the American binary of red or blue, conservative or liberal, Palestine or Israel, affirming or traditional? We have more than 2 political parties in Canada, at least 4 founding peoples, more than 5 regions, and a Multiculturalism Act to boot. Is there a way out of the binary, the polarized imagination? This is what it feels like. We here in Canada have our table, and we sit across from our fellow Canadians in this wonderful restaurant, and the meal is set before us, and then we watch what the Americans are doing on our TVs and ignore each other. Can we not think in a different frame? Can we not minister in a contextual, local, regional, Canadian way that has ties to other places on the globe? That's what Canada is. That's what Christian faith should be. We have gifts here. We have conversations here. And certainly not to do this in a nationalistic way. The Christian tradition is wide and deep, and it's time to trade our religious goods with the other regions of the globe in a non-tariff sort of way. We have the connections to move beyond a binary if we can only imagine it. That's one important theme in the book, and Angela will take things further.
Oh, sorry. You can go back. Too far. Thank you. So I'm going to pick up on one of the themes, one of the questions Peter mentioned about what time is it for your church? And a quote that I think illustrates that question really well is, "It's going to take some doing to see this undoing through." It's from Ani DeFranco from 1999. So the ICS, it has a place in my heart too. I used to go to the summer conferences when I was a kid. I was 10 in the 80s, and we remember running around, hearing the praise and worship music in the gym, and afterward there would be watermelon, and I have this memory of a line of men with a seed spitting competition afterward, and it's kind of that vibe. And it was exciting, and it was a fun place. My sister worked for the ICS, my uncle, and it's really special to have my mom and dad here today. My dad is an ICS grad as well. So thank you so much for having us. So Peter and I wrote a complex book on a pretty quickly evolving topic. And already we started 3.5 years ago, already feels like we wrote it in a different context than some of what we're living through right now. But the strange thing is that some of what we wrote, such as the need for Canadian churches to divest themselves of the unhealthier parts of American evangelicalism, as Peter outlined, that has actually caught fire just in the last 2 months and even gained new relevance. So based on the feedback we've received and reviews of the book, we've been told that it does something important for individuals going through deconstruction, whether or not they've used that word before. People have said things to us like, "It felt like you were telling my life story," or "I thought I was the only one asking these questions. I thought I was alone." Someone just said that to me yesterday. So to anyone going through deconstruction or having already left the church, you are not alone. And there is another shore on the other side. A few fellow travelers are there already. The second thing we hoped our book would do is speak prophetically to the church and Christian institutions. The reasons why people are deconstructing are the same hot button issues that leaders in church, school, and nonprofit ministries are facing, and even in families. And those are ignored at their peril. So to anyone in charge of a group of Christians where some people are deconstructing, others are pushing back against that deconstruction, you are not alone either. And there are ways to engage both sides. Other camps have also gone through this before. So we talk about peril in the book, and the graphic that we put on the front page is the portage, as Peter explained, that communicates our hope for the future, which is to pick up and move in some form. The peril is illustrated more by these 3 graphics, which were also made by the same designer, and they represent different categories in the book of different types of deconstruction, or at the very least, different types of ways that deconstruction can feel. So you might feel that you're paddling in a remote waterway and you're adrift and you're lost. You might feel like you've hit something, hit a rock, reached the rapids, maybe you got turned around or lost, maybe you capsized completely. So while we were writing, we had some decisions to make about that metaphor. A few of the working titles at different points, I think we had 100 titles that we tried, discarded. But we had a few titles that leaned into that sense of peril. So one working title was Whitewater Psalms. Another one was Riding the Rapids of Deconstruction in Canada, or Bushwhacking Faith in Post-Christian Canada. But as you know, we landed on something more hopeful, which is Blessed Are the Undone. Because we really believe that in that place, sometimes disorienting, sometimes painful, there's also a measure of blessing. And the undone in our title sounds singular. It's a phrase we coined, as Peter said, to parallel the nuns and duns. It builds on the thesis that language needs to change to reflect the changing times. Religion used to be a done deal. You were born, baptized, buried in the same church. Now, even if you stay rooted, religious institutions and attitudes are twisting and turning around us. So it's more than secularization. It's that we as Christians need different ways of understanding belief, behavior, and belonging. Because Peter and I think that religious studies need more language to explain new patterns, we added this category, as I said. It sounds singular, but actually it's about more than individuals. It's about Christian institutions who are also in the process of becoming undone. But the good news is that for those groups, there's a blessing as well. So in the words of Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. Or to paraphrase his countryman, Tolkien, we don't get to choose the times we live in, but we can choose how to live in the times we are in. So with those quotes in mind, I'd like to walk you through the steps of understanding whether there's a crisis in your organization, one area becoming undone, related to any of the reasons why what Peter listed, individuals are deconstructing, and then kind of flip that. So you don't see it as a sign of the end times, but really an opportunity that you don't want to waste. In other words, we'll excavate the crisis for its potential blessings. So if you've had a chance to read our book, you'll know we're not referring to the hashtag blessed. Our definition hinges on a New Testament rather than Old Testament definition of blessing, with credit to Peter for this insight. The Old Testament makes the connection between righteousness and God's blessing. From Job to King David, God's favor comes in the form of the blessing of possessions and land and families and armies. The New Testament, on the other hand, begins with the Beatitudes, where Jesus blesses the poor in spirit and those who mourn. This feels like whiplash, or at the very least a paradox. How are the persecuted blessed exactly? Well, the New Testament blessing has to do with context. Jesus is talking to a bunch of exiles, stragglers. The Jews have trickled back to the promised land after being exiled in Babylon because king after king failed miserably. Kingdom split. Now they're living under Roman occupation. They do not feel blessed in the Old Testament way. And the church in Canada today does not feel blessed in the Old Testament way. Denominations are splintering, as many of our pastors have failed, just like the Israelite kings. We've seen that our heroes have feet of clay. We are scattered and living in exile. And into that space, Jesus preaches a New Testament blessing of humility, of trust, of learning to rely fully on God, who has called us and gifted us to lead in different ways, in different places, for different times. Through this kind of blessing, we can understand people who are suffering because we're honest about our own brokenness. So we'll just take a few minutes to talk about the ways that the Canadian church, maybe even evangelicalism, has come undone. And we'll just begin by agreeing it's not a bad thing. Blessed are the undone. Blessed are those who look for hope in the middle of a crisis. So speaking of crises, current events feel like we're living kind of in the middle of a fire hall, and there's like a 5-alarm fire going off pretty much every minute. Every sector feels like it's at that level. It's overwhelming. But even if we're facing multiple crises at once, and I think we are, I'd like to show you how to put each crisis in its place in terms of timing, which is a kind of beautiful way of adjusting the urgency, and I think it might help us figure out what to focus on. So my inspiration for this comes from Stephen Fink. This is a crisis model from 1986. It breaks a crisis down into 4 parts. So there's crisis prevention, preparedness, response, and management. It's pretty straightforward, but I find it really helpful. There's a logic behind these categories. In the middle of a crisis, that's not when you're going to start writing the handbook. So it shows us there's a time to respond and a time to prepare. I also really appreciate how this just normalizes the idea of problems, framing it as cyclical, and it shows how preparation and management can mitigate the effects. So, to repeat the question Peter asked earlier, what time is it for you? What time is it for your church or your organization? If you've read the book and heard Peter, you know that we identified these 7 triggers. They don't all apply equally in every situation. So I think it's helpful to use crisis model to sort through the triggers and then decide whether and how to respond. So the meeting house, for example, which Peter mentioned, they were in full crisis mode for about a year after the allegations of abuse against Bruxy Cavey in 2021. And that was really a test of their ability to respond. And judging by the fact that they've now been shut down by insurance companies, you could say they failed, but they did some good work in the process of humbly admitting where they went wrong and rewriting things like their life story online. So most churches, thankfully, are not in the active stage of clergy sexual abuse crisis management, but that's good because then you have a chance to get over thinking that could never happen here, right? And actively work instead toward preventing it. So this is just an example, by the way. I put the mistreatment of LGBTQ community in the active crisis phase because, as you know, it's the main thing in the Christian Reformed Church right now. And because more than 50% of the people we interviewed mentioned it. Purity culture and colonization, I put in the post-crisis category because when those topics came up among the people we interviewed, they were referring to events in the past. The actual crisis is behind us, but what's relevant now is whether the church is learning from its past mistakes, learning healthier ways to teach sexual ethics, for example, in the case of the emphasis on the purity culture, which really was just a 1990s thing. So, a couple more examples. How can we use this to respond? In the case of colonization, doing what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asked for was specifically, I think of their 93 calls, there were 8 to churches, and one of them was education. And there were some for schools as well in the calls to action. So our local Christian elementary school, just in the last 2 years, started marking Orange Shirt Day. And in addition to inviting the students to wear orange, they do a lot of other great things. Teachers have added in lessons about the history of residential schools. There's a new section, a shelf in the library with books about it. And they send material home to parents to have everything work together. I see this as a very positive development, part of the post-crisis management stage. That school community taking responsibility and raising awareness in the ways that they can. I have biblical inerrancy, this is preparedness. What I think could be fruitful here is a bit of open-handedness in how to read the Bible. Maybe youth group leaders who talk about different styles in different sections of Scripture, or an attitude of reverence and respect without elevating the Bible, as Peter said, to the same level as God, fourth member of the Trinity. Those are just small ways that could help prevent individuals from deconstructing when they come across contradictions later. So, chapter 22 in our book takes inspiration from indigenous wisdom to create a 1,000-year plan for churches. Now, I've done a few workshops since the book came out last September, trying to give a talk similar to how Peter started, and then inviting participants to create some kind of 1,000-year plan for their organization. Okay, it has not gone well. It's very difficult, and I understand that. We hear comments back like, well, I'll be happy if the world still is here in 1,000 years because of climate change. Or our ministry just wrote a 5-year plan, and that was really hard. Our culture values the current moment above all else, right? We don't spend much time taking a long-term perspective on things. 1,000 years is pretty far in the future. It's too far to cash in any returns on our investments, right? Why are we going to talk about it? What's the point? But I think to give a bit of grace to that attempt and the difficulty of it, another reason why the 1,000-year view is hard is if you are currently in the crisis response stage, or if it feels like your country or your organization is in there. So let's give ourselves a bit of breathing room. It's okay to focus on now if the issue you're dealing with is actively in crisis. You probably don't have much choice, actually. There's decisions coming at you every day. If applying this crisis model to your setting helps you see that for a different trigger, you might be in another stage that gives you a bit of space to deal with it, then take advantage of that. Buy the book at lunch if you don't have a copy yet and reread chapter 22 because we go through that. But I'd like to end this portion of the day by laying a bit of groundwork for how you or your church or your organization can foster reconstruction. So lots of people have already asked Peter and I, when is the sequel coming out? When are you going to write Blessed Are the Redone? Well, I don't think the church is there yet. We didn't interview people in great depths about their stories of reconstruction, although we did ask about it. But there is no 12-step plan to reconstruct the great Canadian church. However, there are postures that can be taken. If I had to summarize it in 4 words, I would say that a posture of trust, humility, honesty, and repentance are a really good start for any individual, church, or Christian community wanting to foster some kind of reconstruction. Or just to put it even more simply, to be a reconstruction-friendly setting for the people that you care about or care for. So these are signposts, we call them in the book, trail markers. In the language of Portage, we don't say that there's a map. There's not this specific thing, but there are some signposts, and those are trail markers for the way forward. And we trust in God's providence and leading as to the final destination. Novelist Nora Hill Hudson once said, "Some years are the questions, some years are the answers." I think we're between those two kinds of years. And for the Easter issue of Christian Courier, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, Brian Walsh has written a meditation on Isaiah 65 called Resurrection Among the Ruins. Can hope be born in the face of despair, he asks. Can there be resurrection among the ruins? And did that question haunt the prophet, standing in the rubble of Jerusalem, in a city that never really lived up to its name as a place of shalom? Yes, says the prophet, but it hangs on 2 words, no more. It may take some doing to see this undoing through. Thank you.
So before we open the floor to you all, I've got a few questions that I've got more than a few, but I had to limit myself, and I have like 5 questions, which is still too many for Angela and Peter. But I'm going to come sit with you at the table here, and then after we get kind of prime the pump that way and get our juices flowing, we're going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. Hector, did you want people to come up to the, or are you going to run around with the mic, right? You said, okay, cool. All right. Well, now, do you want me to take that?
Yeah.
Okay. No, for you. Thanks.
Dip line on this table all the way.
Okay. So the first question I have is a journalist, a sociologist, and a philosopher walk into a bar. They're all Canadians who received baptism in the Christian Reformed Church in the 1960s or 70s. I actually wasn't sure about you, but
So kind.
Peter and I are firmly Gen X, but I have a feeling you're firmly millennial probably. What do they talk about?
Is this on? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, great question. I think the journalist says, well, did you hear about that overture that went to Synod trying to ban guns that got turned down? That's a real thing. Did you hear about it? And then the sociologists would say, well, let's take a poll to see whether members of the CRC like really want guns at Synod or they don't, or where they stand on that. And then the philosopher says, every overture speaks to the deep longing of our hearts to something like that. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yes. Well, basically, there's no small talk, I don't think. You just go right to the meat of things. Yeah, Ron just sent us these questions yesterday, and I thought, what would those three people have in common? I think a love of questions, asking good questions, and trying to use those questions. I like them to get at stories. You like the data. You like it to lead to more questions, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you know what?
go ahead.
As a sociologist, I like to say, the philosophers are always thinking about the ideas, and they'll say ideas have legs. But the sociologists say, but legs also have ideas. And I think in terms of the Christian Reformed Church right now, we would want to talk about major social forces at work that are conditioning the context in which a lot of things are happening. And I think polarization is a huge part of that.
Great. Thanks. In the second chapter of your book, you say something about faith that deeply resonated with me. It's something that my mentor at ICS, where I did my MA and PhD, Hank Hart, also impressed on me during my graduate studies in the 1990s. And this is the quote from your book. On page 14, you say, faith is not simply knowledge we possess about God. It is trusting God enough to follow him into a deeper solidarity with others and the creation, end quote. So my question, riffing on that quote, is what do you see as the danger in identifying faith with knowledge we possess? How does such purported knowledge help or hinder one's efforts to follow God into a deeper solidarity with others and creation? And maybe you can even comment on whether the deconstruction process itself is an attempt to so follow God.
Yeah, knowledge used to be the thing that we were on a quest for. Yes. This one? Okay.
Oh, this one, if you prefer. It's up to you.
I will share this one. You hold on to that one. Knowledge used to be something we all desired deeply, right? And it was something we were in pursuit of. And so, especially Christian Reformed people build educational institutions, and they talk about worldview. But knowledge has come on hard times. It's become incredibly problematic, and the connection between knowledge and power is difficult to pull apart, to tease. And we still need knowledge. Even we're talking here about knowledge, but we say it's not simply knowledge, but it's about trust. And I guess this is the problem. When our trust in God shifts from being in God, the source of all being and life and mystery, and then it becomes focused on some doctrinal conviction. And that's a form of idolatry or ideology. And we can all make efforts to, or sacrifices for this ideology that hurt people and the creation. And that's what that statement is really getting at. I think of the young earth creationism trigger that we talked about, where we deny the heavens declaring the glory of God and their own history. And maybe that focus on a literal understanding of Genesis 1, that knowledge gets us to mistreat an astronomy professor, let's say at an educational institution that we all know, and he feels the pressure to leave. And that way people get hurt when we make that knowledge the source of our trust and hope. And I'm talking about Howard Van Til.
Yeah, maybe just add that it can go the other way too, where we kind of overvalue experience instead of knowledge. And so that you see that sometimes in, for example, if a writer has maybe 5 memoirs and they're in their 30s, and you think, what happened in your life? Or Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller was one of the first of these kind of deconstructing memoirs where the experience was the thing that made everything else make sense. And it becomes the final say. When people say it's my truth, that's kind of what they mean there. In the book, we quote Jamie Smith, who says deconstruction is a turn to the other. So it's a view to look beyond yourself and your own experience and grow into that deeper solidarity with others. It's not instead of knowledge, but it would be in addition to it, I would say.
Thanks. So, a strength of your book I found is the nuanced way you portray faith deconstruction as a personal journey. Well, you also said a communal journey as well. But it can take many forms and have many different outcomes for different people. So, as I listened to different stories narrated in the book, I noticed an interesting mixture of activity and passivity in those undertaking or undergoing faith deconstruction. So, how do how have you come to understand after all these interviews? How have you come to understand this relationship between activity and passivity, or between, let's say, the willful decision to tear it all down and the more passive experience, let's say, of finding that a spirituality you once held so dear has simply crumbled all around you? Are these two different experiences, or perhaps maybe are they two sides of the same coin?
Yeah, I think we drove our publisher crazy a little bit in the rough draft time, because at one point our definition of deconstruction was at least a page long. It was very long. It's hard. We went back and forth so many times. What does it mean? How can we pin it down? What are the facets? We didn't use the language of active and passive that you do, but we reference internal and external types of deconstruction. So sometimes it can be happening kind of invisibly. People are mulling things over intellectually. They're wrestling with things nobody else knows. They don't talk about it with their families. Sometimes it's very external. It's an event outside of that person happens, and it sort of starts this series of things. And they can happen at the same time. They can happen because you instigated the process, or because something happened to you that kind of set things off. So among the people we interviewed, Michael Koren, I remember his description he said it felt like someone picked me up by the collar and shook me around. And Brad Jerzak, I think, says, felt like I was drowning and I hit like the bottom of the ocean. So those are more passive. Something happened to them. But other people we interviewed had active language. So you go to metaphor, right? When you don't know how to describe something like this. So people would say, like, I was unpacking this very full closet and taking out what I thought I wanted to keep. Somebody else described it like deconstruction was like walking into an open field. So I think, to answer your question, they are two sides of the same coin. And we've used the word trigger in our definition as well. And that, interestingly, works both ways with your question. So you can pull the trigger yourself, but something can also trigger you. So I think our word choice here is kind of cool because it stretches to fit that layer that you added.
Right.
Take one trigger, for example, and one that's been part of my biography is bearing witness to men who commit acts of sexual misconduct. And when clergy, it's known as clergy sexual abuse. And I've watched a lot of people respond to this, and it hits them as something that happened to me, right? It happened to our congregation. But then how you respond to it is your active piece of it, right? And people respond in different ways. For some, the faith of Christianity is so closely tied to that individual that their faith falters, right? Others will say, well, people are broken and I knew that, and leaders are broken. Doesn't change the faith for me. One horrible quote that came from the Walrus after the Meeting House scandal broke, and it didn't have to do with KV because there are other examples of sexual misconduct and abuse in the Meeting House, and this was about some of the other ones. But she said, now when I think of Christianity, I think of abuse. And I think there's an active and passive piece in that response. It's not something that just happened to her, but it's how she's interpreting the event.
Thank you. So right now I'm reading a book called Split Tooth, and it's the memoir of a Canadian Inuit throat singer, Tanya Tagaq. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this book or not, but in it she offers the following advice, and I, having reading this at the same time as your book, I found it to resonate with the hard-won wisdom of many of those who have walked a deconstructing path. So she says in that book, we'll spend our lives trying to contemplate and encapsulate the divinity of spirit, only to blunder forth and never relax into letting the communication happen, right? Sorry. So, in your explorations of faith deconstruction, have you noticed a similar wish to simply suspend something like a feverish chasing after or desire to encapsulate divinity? You do have a chapter about deconstructing people returning to more ancient elements of the faith, and I thought maybe there's something there. Another way of thinking about this question is whether faith deconstruction must always be simultaneous with or followed by faith reconstruction. Might there not already be something spiritually edifying about tarrying with the silence or the void that faith deconstruction leaves in its wake without rushing to fill it, right? Like letting it come to you, kind of, I guess, if we're using the passive active analogy.
Yeah. Are we good at this in the Christian Reformed tradition? I'm assuming a lot of the people online too are coming or know about this tradition, this sort of negative theology, the apophatic side of theology. I don't think so. We're good constructionists. But in that chapter you named on those who return to the ancient church, one Canadian theologian in particular, Brad Jerzak, has gone from his evangelical upbringing to the Orthodox Church and found a lot of what you're saying. And he quotes in his book Out of the Embers, his Orthodox Metropolitan Callistos Ware, and this is right along the same lines as your quote, true faith is constant dialogue with doubt. For God is incomparably greater than all our preconceptions about him. Our mental concepts are idols that need to be shattered. So to be fully alive, our faith needs to continually die. I think there's something really uncomfortable about that. And I think that's the uncomfortableness that a lot of people have with our book and with deconstruction. It's the apophatic question, you might say. I think that's where you're going there, Ron. Is faith best in a space of unknowing? Is much of God hidden from us as human creatures? And that's the liminal space that we talk about in the book, a space of unknowing, of being betwixt and between. But I think you can't live there. We need a camp. We need a shelter. We need others. We need to talk positively as well. And apophatic, I think, is a necessary part of the faith journey. But I don't think you can stay there long together and practice something, create a theology that nurtures people and children. It's got to be more.
Yeah, when I read your questions, Ron, yesterday, in between, one kid's at badminton, one had the dentist, someone's home late, you're picking up the car, one is at the mechanic, and I thought, it felt like I was back in school, and that was like that, that teacher that always had an essay question that had 17 things in one question, and I was like, okay, all right, I'm going to boil it down here. But maybe to connect to that moment, we have a chapter on the role of the internet in our book, and there's two things that relate to your question. The internet kind of shows us behind the curtain in a way that it didn't, right? And so that's why it can feel like there are so many more cases of clergy sexual abuse or some of these other problems. They can feel like they're everywhere because you just hear about all of them. We know more than ever, and it can be very disillusioning. But I think secondly, the internet, the hectic pace of it doesn't really leave a lot of room for the spirit or for what you were asking about. So somehow we need a digital detox or some kind of just healthier habits around technology. Otherwise, I don't think we can relax, as you say, quote, relax into letting communion happen. And among the people we interviewed, there was a really wide range of answers on the question of, are you reconstructing? 4 people out of the 28 would say they no longer believe in God and they fully deconverted. But everybody else, they're in all different places, everywhere along the spectrum. And even those who said they don't believe in God, that's right now, right? That's a snapshot of a moment in time. We don't know. Only God knows what the full picture of those stories will be. So to get back to your first question, is reconstruction necessary? I think if you don't have it, deconstruction is pretty bleak. I think humans need hope, and hope is active. Hope usually takes some kind of action. The problem is deconstruction is just a metaphor. It doesn't work perfectly on everything and apply to all these situations. But I think we do need reconstruction, even if that doesn't look like the way the metaphor seems like it should look like, if that makes sense. So silence can be a reconstructive act. You're just uh, lament, like they might not, those parts might not fit the metaphor perfectly. One psalm that I keep coming back to throughout the process of writing this book is Psalm 42, because I think inside of that, there are each of these three movements that we've found. So the psalmist says, he feels abandoned. Where are you, God? Tears are my food. Oh, sorry. The first part, construction, is I used to go to the temple, he says. So he's remembering the faith of an earlier time. But then in this moment, tears are my food. And then at the very end, he says, but I will yet praise you. And so he has that future tense. It's like an anchor that he's clinging to, even though it hasn't happened yet. He's there. So individually, I don't think you can really like foist reconstruction on anybody, but institutionally, I think it really is important and needs to happen.
Yeah, you guys make me think of a tabernacle versus a temple, something that, like when you talked about needing a camp, but maybe one that you need to be able to take down and move when, and because not to get too deeply into Derrida, but as I understand him, deconstruction isn't just destruction. Always when you're deconstructing, there's a simultaneous reconstructing happening. But the idea is that if attentive to the needs of the other, you will always see the need for this process to be continual, right? But thanks for your answer about the that was interesting food for thought. I'd like to hear what others will think. So my final question is about connecting God's call to a deeper solidarity with others, which you talked about at the beginning of the book. And throughout the book, really. I looked for the word solidarity in your index and it wasn't there, but it does appear often. So I was kind of trying to find the places where it existed, but I would have had to done a word search. So I want to connect the idea of a deeper solidarity with others with the fact of religious pluralism in Canada, right? Because it's a Canadian context. And I'm thinking especially of the religious-secular divide. So not so much interfaith dialogue, but the divide between believers and atheists. So the Trappist monk Thomas Merton in the 1960s penned an article called Apologies to an Unbeliever, in which he recognized that unbelief too can be a kind of spiritual receptivity or listening, akin to kind of the contemplative forms of religion that we've been talking about. So this is a quote. I've always loved this quote. He says, faith comes by hearing, says St. Paul, but by hearing what? The cries of snake handlers, the platitudes of the religious operator. One must first be able to listen to the inscrutable ground of his own being. And who am I to say that your reservations, like the unbeliever, about religious commitment do not protect in you this kind of listening? I thought that was an amazing moment of solidarity for a Christian to express to an unbeliever. And so we've seen so much polarization and mutual recrimination between these two groups, but what might solidarity between them look like? And does Merton's quote give us a clue?
Yeah, Ron, when I read that question, I thought, that's Ron's research. That's what he writes about and thinks about. Like, we didn't really talk about atheists in the book. Deconstruction is not about atheism per se, although some land there. Only 4 out of 28, as we said, landed in some sort of unchristian space, but it wasn't necessarily a creedal atheism. I think if religious people become totally deconstructed, they are worth a conversation. We all have blind spots, and atheists do too. Can there be a Lenten listening to atheists to help us do some spring cleaning in our religious baggage and our religious bumbling? Merold Westphal wrote a book on that, right? That's right. Suspicion and Faith, Lenten practice in listening to atheists like Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. Thank you. So I agree.
Yeah, and I would just add, it's more than just between those two groups. It's between all the subcategories of whatever. It's endless, right? Spiritual but not religious, spiritually curious, ex-evangelical. If we had to rename our book based on Merton's title, we could say something like Apologies to Believers with Mixed Feelings About the Church, maybe. And in terms of apologies, we say apologies is actually a good place to start rather than apologetics, which is maybe what was emphasized 20 years ago. I think it's also important to remember, Jesus didn't demonize unbelief. He never condemned it, even doubt. He had a lot of grace. So listening, again, to get back to the experiences, listening to the experiences and not just hearing each other, but listening. There's a bit of a difference there. And in my work at Christian Courier, like that has to be the starting place. I have to believe it's some antidote to the polarization in some way.
So we're open the questions to people in the audience now, and if any questions from the folks online.
Thank you both very much for your presentations and for your work on the book. It's amazing that it exists, and I hope it will be a resource for further conversations with others after this. So thanks very much. My question has to do with the relationship between deconstruction and crisis. I was struck by the four-step crisis model, Angela, that you outlined. But I'm wondering though if I think, Peter, as you said, if deconstruction is a sort of normal or can be a normal and necessary part of a faith. And I'm thinking about organizations and communities here. If that's true, if there's a sense in which deconstruction is a normal part of faith, and that means that a normal part of faith is a kind of crisis, should we think differently about whether crisis prevention, about that as one of the steps on that sort of rubric for organizations, right? Should we think differently about whether crisis is something we really want to prevent? Of course, there are certain crises we do want to prevent when it comes to things like abuse and other such things. But in terms of the crisis that is one's feeling adrift or feeling capsized, like those sort of deconstructive feelings, is that something that organizations can maybe not so much prevent, but learn to prepare for if it is a sort of normal and necessary part of a vibrant faith?
Well, I think what we're trying to get at with that model is the deconstruction is normal, but the triggers and the types of crises causing it are not. So, but yeah, I appreciate the nuance in that question. I'm gonna have to think more about that. Want to add anything?
I think we got to rethink that piece. We didn't use the word crisis much in the book. That's kind of came afterwards, right? I mean, the opposite would be, do we want to be crisis instigators, right? And a lot of people make careers off that sort of thing. So I don't know. We have to think a little more about what we mean by that. Thanks for the question. I don't know if Ron wants to jump in.
No, it's a good point that if deconstruction can be seen as a normal part of faith, like in our tradition we call it continuous reformation, right? Then what might be the role of church or community in creating safe spaces for that, maybe, is what I hear in your question, and paying more attention to that question rather than forestalling that kind of thing or trying to prevent it or avoid it or silence it. Can a place be can a church or a school or an institution create an environment where that can take place in a healthy way or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew and Pierre, for these very perceptive, bringing us into confrontation with where we're at in our world and in our church today. I was struck especially by a comment you made toward the end, Angela, and I thought about, this asking people to think with the Indigenous people 1,000 years in advance, how that falls flat, and how much our current culture is focused on the moment. And in that respect, my own work, academic work, scholarly work of the last years has focused on the 4th century. And that's more than 1,000 years ago. This year, 2025, we celebrate the 1700th year of the Nicene Creed. This is 1700 years ago. And I think the fact that we are not into history is perhaps a part of our being able to think 1,000 years in advance. Because here we are in a period in the church which was so turbulent that the church could easily have split 5 or more directions. And I think it's important to say that it didn't. And that's not the work of human. It's the Holy Spirit at work in the church. So history has some lessons for us, and I think the fact that we're so much in the moment is also has its dangers, real dangers for not thinking about where our grandchildren are going to land up, or thinking that we might be here for another 50 or even 1,000 years.
Yeah, Peter can add to this. We've definitely talked about that aspect. So maybe what I can rework on that slide is adding something about the value of history in understanding the richness of the Christian tradition. We talk about globally going wide, but also going back in time, and then understanding if that is part of the way your faith is developed. I think it makes a big difference in understanding where you are. You can explain that.
I think so much of what we live in and believe calcifies over time, and it becomes a reification that takes on an objectivity that's way beyond its human reality. And maybe what you're saying is anthropological in a way, that we're transient creatures and we create transient institutions, and that allows for a lot of freedom. And that allows us to see deconstruction as something that happens all the time, has always happened, and will always happen. And it's part of a humility of being creatures. I think, too, Jane Jacobs popped in my head, this Trontonian writer who talked about cultural amnesia, how we've forgotten so much.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the role of the church, or and give you the chance to amplify some of your comments. The church can play a big role both in deconstruction and in reconstruction. And we've seen many examples of that, how, in your book, these people were attending churches where they were helped in their deconstruction. How about also in the process of reconstruction? If your pastor, for example, or the church leaders have gone through this process and have helped themselves, and others to reconstruct their faith, that's good. But if your church is not doing that, and I see that many examples of that, where these churches are not yet at that stage of where they can reconstruct their own faith or the faith of others. Anyway, just a comment and a question.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I think there's an important role to play for the church in conserving things, but too often we become people who protect things, and we want to protect institutions from being deconstructed. And so to get past that resistance, first of all, a lot of what we noticed in our sample is that reconstruction was much harder than deconstruction. It's easier to tear something down than to build it up. And a lot of them, we never asked the question, what are you reconstructing? We just asked, what's next, right? And a lot of them were like, I don't know. Like they're still in the wilderness. They're still wandering and searching. A lot of them were in therapy. So not just the church is serving, right? There are other cultural sectors that are part of the healing process. And psychotherapy was named by a lot of people. So I think reconstruction becomes an open possibility when the resistance and the protection have stopped. and our hands are open instead of gripping, right? Our cold, out of my cold, dead hands, said somebody once. Not the way of the open hand.
We have a few questions coming from the folks online, and we're gonna maybe give a chance to 3 questions from online, and then we'll return to in person.
From Dr. J. Richard Middleton. I live in the USA. A lot of Christians I know are encouraging us to reach out and listen to those who have supported Trump as a road to reconciliation and healing. How do we distinguish between those we should listen to and those who would simply demonize us?
That's not in the book. No, we'll give us some time to think about that, because that is the moment we're in. Maybe repeat the question, the final question again.
Yeah, the last.
He asks, how do we distinguish between those we should listen to and those who would simply demonize us?
While you guys are thinking about it, I'm just kind of thinking Rich's question might have something to do with the listening you mentioned, Angela. Like, I think in times of depolarization, if the gulf between you is too vast, that a conversation, you'll just be speaking past each other and at cross purposes. That might be a criterion where we say, well, it's not fruitful for me to talk to this person right now or to talk to this group. But then the question was, where's the hope for eventually bridging a gap like that, or creating spaces where a gap like that could be bridged? And I don't have the answer to that now. But I mean, I think that's the difficulty of our historical moment, is the worse polarization gets. You just scroll through TikTok or whatever. You see people really convinced on their side that they're through the looking glass and they have a grip on reality, and the other side is completely like insane, like crazy, and we're all gaslighting each other. And that scares me a lot, because intersubjectivity is about supposing to secure a world in common, and if we're living in completely different worlds, and one group has the levers of power, then it can be a pretty scary place. But I haven't answered this question.
I can tell you an anecdote of there's an editorial in the next issue written by my colleague Megan Court, next issue of Christian Courier, and she wrestles with this question. Her husband's co-worker would use the sentence that he loves Trump. And so this was in her editorial. I said, loves? Is that the right word? Do you mean admires, respects? And I wanted to know when that statement was made, and was it recent? And what is it, a month ago? But it's accurate. And so it's a very real, it's current, and it's a word that's used. And it's very real. And I think there's a kind of conversation that can only happen in person, face to face, that's very different from the internet. Has a lot to answer for with what you're describing, of how much it has made it very, very hard to try to understand each other and get past those barriers. I think if you can start, so in person would be my first bit of advice, because it's just almost nearly impossible, not totally, but almost impossible to get there online, I think. And then if you can somehow work backward and find a shared value and start there. So did you vote for Trump? If it can be done politely and amicably, like what was the reason? What were you hoping for? Where's there will be a spot where there's common ground. Oh, you were scared about retirement money or your economics or something. Okay, then work backwards. You will find something that connects with the shared value of yours, and then you go back and you start there, and then move forward. But it is very difficult. I don't know if you want to share it out.
Very briefly, building on what Angela just said, we talk a lot about common grace in the Christian Reformed Church, but maybe we could try to steer the conversation towards a common brokenness, and maybe there's a shared reality there.
The second question is from James Decker. In the class I'm leading on Undone, we keep bumping into the question, What's the difference between deconstruction and constant, ongoing evaluation of the faith, that is, personal, communal? Several of the 15 regular attendees have said they started reevaluating their faith and commitment already in university. Some say it's an ongoing crisis, hence, with lots of pain, but others say it's an almost daily part of their spiritual experience and work.
Very briefly, deconstruction is the moment now that reevaluation is being understood to be. So it's a cultural, historical moment, and it's the language that people are using to talk about that perennial practice. That's how I think we understand it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jim. Yeah, we talked a couple of times while we were working on the book. Wait a second, are we just like appropriating that word and kind of bringing it into the Reformed fold and making it fit our understanding of what it, what faith? And maybe it's possible that happened, but no regrets if so.
Yeah, you could say, we do say this somewhere, deconstruction is reformation. It's not revolution at its best, right? And that distinction's very important. It's not burn it all down. The Holy Spirit is alive and active in some part of what we have already. It's about making it better.
Last question from Carol Rudy. How much of today's deconstruction is the result of a long history of a lack of openness about problems and willingness to do the work of constant reform?
A lot.
Yeah, it's resistance, right? I think that's what the question is getting at. We go in our chapter on liminality and wilderness, we go through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying. And one of them is bargaining, one of them is denial, and we all go through those different stages. I mean, and I can name the others, right? Anger, depression, and then acceptance. And then we add on a sixth that was added on after I think Kubler-Ross died, and that is meaning making. And I think that's what you guys are going to be doing later today, taking the crisis, facing the grief of what's lost, looking ahead to what might be yet, and making some meaning out of it.
Another part of your book that I think speaks to this question is the analogy with the brother-in-law who had his truck stolen, and treating that person who's a victim of a crime through I don't know what all the response or minimization was one, and victim blaming and all that kind of thing. Could that be a kind of way of is that a avoidance writ large, that kind of way of responding to crisis, so that it's sort of and then it keeps building and building to come to a breaking point or something like that?
Yeah, what that metaphor does is illustrate the systems behind types of responses. So that gets at the institutional piece, and that could maybe connect to that last question too. So it compares the response to, so many different organizations when somebody's vehicle is stolen. It just this all happens very straightforward. It's replaced, no questions asked, money back. There's police are involved, insurance company, nobody blames the victim, all those things. So when I started to think about what happens in a church setting, and this was specific to one of the triggers, which is abuse in a church setting, none of the things in place to protect vehicles is there for people. And so yes, you can do your safe church work and have doors with windows and so on and so forth, but unless there are actual entire systems where all the pieces are working together to properly address, respond, prevent, and make amends and all of those things, then, and they're not there. And so there is a failing that on at the institutional level in that particular case or type of problem. Yeah.
I would just like to say thank you very much for your work. And the word structure has really popped into my mind over and over again during this discussion. I grew up memorizing catechism questions and answers, and there was absolutely no room to discuss the question or the answer. It was seen as a great threat. Any kind of questioning was just purely rote. So that's the way the living faith was structured. Questions and answers, supposedly very clear. I'm just thinking about church structures. Some structures really allow for all kinds of space for abuse to happen. Not sharing leadership within the church, not going with who's gifted at what. And so recognizing those gifts as part of leading. So just, I'm not even sure I have a question. I'd just like to thank you for your work. And it's also the whole definition of deconstruction has been really helpful for me, that it's always happening. And reconstruction is always happening. And that's a huge blessing. So I guess no question.
Thank you.
I could just respond. It's very interesting. Is this still working? Okay. It's very interesting. I think ICS has been talking about deconstruction for decades already, right? Like Jim Oldhouse has been there, done that, talked about it, and others in ICS.
Our
Now-
problem is we do it 30 or 40 years before the church is ready for it.
That's what is happening here. Like Angela and I, our book was #1 on Amazon for months in the different subcategories that it's in, like Sociology of Religion Canada, right? People are buying it. They're having book studies about it across the country. And we're being asked, Angela and I will be on tour in different ways at different times, but it includes Edmonton and Calgary and Vancouver and Victoria. Why didn't ICS have this, big response? And why is this book being embraced by so many people? And we get these testimonies of thank you. And this makes sense to me. Do we have the answer to the question I'm asking? I don't know, but we're just receiving, the sense of the moment that we've struck a nerve that maybe, as you say, people weren't ready for 30 years ago.
Timing is everything is all I'll say. And sometimes you can fall into timing, but I think if I were to look, like, I've been a student at ICS since 1992, so I've been involved with the institution in some way, shape, or form. And I think what is needed, and I think your book demonstrates this quite well, is a sort of a pastoral sense of traveling along with, inviting questions, not sort of catechizing or preaching or prophetic critique that doesn't sort of have a pastoral side to it. ICS wants to be a university for the people, and maybe it hasn't always been that. But again, I look back on that legacy, and I'm proud of it because even quite recently in the Reformed Journal, a former professor from Calvin brought up Hank Hart and his anti-racist message and his critique of white supremacy in the 1980s. And it's of the moment now. And perhaps it wasn't as salient for people back then, even though it was still an issue. And so you don't know how these legacies will be used when they'll pop up again. So I think ICS is kind of, sometimes it's been stone alone, I like to say, and for principled reasons, but it has been a painful place often for the institution and people associated with it to be in.
And to be fair, what we studied and what we wrote about is a phenomenon that's going crazy on the internet. And it was Publishers Weekly that said there are more memoirs on deconstruction than fidget spinners. So our timing isn't, we didn't create this. It's happening. And Trump, we certainly did not create, but he is a pivotal figure in the deconstruction of faith in North America. And that's the timing.
I just want to say, with the focus on the Canadian context that you have, with the fact that it's rooted in interviews and narrative, and some deep theological wrestling with what's going on, and even just the category of Undone, I think they're all unique, original contributions to what is, like you say, a pretty massive, almost industry, right? And you wanted to cut through a lot of that noise, and I think you succeeded in that. So kudos.
Thanks, Ron. That's very nice of you.
We have one last question from Wilma Vanderleek. Can you speak about faith of Jesus, not just faith in Jesus, as one of the positive 1,000-year moves we could make? Not least because it might also take us 1,000 years back to earlier, more synthesized, holistic senses of faith?
I think the 4 postures that were on the screen at the end speak to that. Jesus embodied all of those characteristics. So there was trust, humility, repentance, and the 4th one. They all apply. I'm positive. Thank you for the question, Wilma.
Yeah, and I think Angela's saying, and I think Wilma, what you're getting at is maybe we've had a history of too much belief in Christ and creed, right? Some sort of notion of belief as the pinnacle of what faith is about. And now we're asking, how did Jesus act? What did he teach? And how can I follow him in my daily life and as a church community in a post-Christian world? What would that look like? And if we're on the brink of a more war, what does it mean to be people who follow the Prince of Peace?
If I could end with Hank Hart one more time. What I think is interesting in Wilma's question too is Hank would always say, whenever you read in an English translation of the Bible, Jesus saying, "Believe me when I say to you," read it instead as "Trust me when I say to you." Like, you can follow this example rather than, I'm not stating something that's the case for you to intellectually agree with. I'm telling you to trust me and follow where I'm pointing or go where I'm pointing. So anyway.
And what does that mean for ICS, which is a place of ideas, right? I mean, if we're thinking about deconstruction and reconstruction in our institutions, I don't know, I want to ask Ron a question.
Well, I think we have to, Cal was fond of saying ideas have legs, right? And I think there's something about ICS is unique as an educational institution because of our really grassroots funded donor model. We run ourselves like a church. That's part of my problem right now as president, but it does keep you more in a healthy way attentive to the grassroots people that support you and what their issues are and what they would like to see us provide spiritual nourishment for, intellectual reflection upon. A lot of what, when I became the director of our research center, I saw my job as to not so much do research and then tell people about it, but to do more community-based research, which is the mantra of community-based research is nothing about us without us. And to actually just curate spaces where you can, ICS can bring its gifts of its intellectual gifts to bear, but in service of helping people have good conversations about these kinds of things. One of the sort of things that I'm most proud of in my tenure at ICS was from 2013 to 15, we had a $200,000 SHIRK connection grant in partnership with the Christian Reformed Church in Canada and a place called the Center for Community-Based Research in Kitchener-Waterloo. And we spent 2 years going into churches, interviewing people about how they understood the relationship between the gospel's call to justice and their own faith life. And out of that, we developed a one-act play that we had performed in several cities. And some of my favorite things that I've ever done at ICS was to go to the facilitated dialogue events where people first saw the play and they saw reflected themselves in this artwork. And it was through that artwork that they could then ask really great questions or come up with really great insights or feel safe to tell their own story. And it was so rich that I think, so that's one of the ways that I think ICS, and we've done that. We've done this. I mean, I can't go anywhere and talking about ICS, and people come up to me and it's like, we got married and we met at one of your ICS family conferences. And I think what we've been trying to do for the last 5 or 6 years is I don't know if people would come to a family conference, cookout, camp out for 3 days anymore, but if we can recapture that vibe where we're part of people's dinner table conversation again, I think is a great way to be a Christian school and a witness as a Christian school. So, I mean, that's my elevator speech, and you set me up for it. So that's wrapping up. You want to wrap it up, Hector? You want me to? So I'll just thank everybody for coming. Thank everybody online. Great questions, great discussion. Thank you, Angela and Peter, for coming out. And yeah, and we have we have lunch and a day left for people here. And otherwise, I'll let Hector wrap things up.
First, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a few housekeeping items. First, there are copies of the book in the back that you can purchase. Just ask any of us a question about that, and then we'll let you know how. Second, folks online, thank you for joining us. Some of you are too far to come in person, but those of you who are able to, our next event, to come in person, we invite you to come and join us here in the flesh. You will be able to have some goodies. So those of you who are in person, we have a little bit of a light lunch there. If you want something heartier, you can walk down the street. There are tons of restaurants around here, but if not, there is enough there to keep you going for the afternoon. Something else for folks online as well before you leave. No, you are setting me up for success here. We have lots of lifelong learning opportunities coming up. So we have an event happening on May 14th, specifically on gender, sexuality, and the Bible. That's a webinar happening in the evening that day. All of you, we have your email addresses. You'll receive information about that event. And we have also a course with Sylvia Kismet in the fall, starting the second week of September on the same topic. That's 8 weeks, 2 hours in the evening, a course that you can take online while you're having dinner. So we are trying to really embody that call of being part of the dinner table conversation. So again, thank you. We'll see you folks who are here in person back in about an hour. So we'll start shortly after 1 p.m. Thank you.